I never thought sharing one screenshot in a family group chat would upend everything I thought I knew about my life. The moment I hit send on the divorce papers, I thought my family would either pity me or rally behind me. Instead, my mother's reply shattered everything I believed about trust, love, and the people I was supposed to lean on the most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Miller, and I'm 34 years old, born and raised in Ohio, and for most of my life, I thought I had everything under control. On paper, my life looked picture perfect: a stable career as a high school guidance counselor, a modest but warm home in the suburbs of Dayton, and a husband, Mark, who I thought was the kind of man other women envied. We had been married for 7 years, and while no marriage is without its ups and downs, I truly believed ours was built on mutual respect and love. It's only now, looking back, that I realized how much of my life was built on illusions carefully curated by him and tolerated by me, because I was too afraid to face the truth. The first cracks in my so-called perfect marriage didn't happen overnight. They came quietly, in moments I brushed off as normal. Late nights at the office that stretched into early mornings, vague explanations about new clients he couldn't talk about because of confidentiality, the way he stopped making eye contact at the dinner table and instead scrolled endlessly through his phone. I told myself all marriages go through rough patches, that we were both just tired, that it was part of growing older together. Deep down, though, there was always a knot in my stomach, a whisper that told me something was terribly wrong. The breaking point came when I stumbled across the email. Mark had left his laptop open one morning before work, and as much as I wanted to respect his privacy, the subject line, "I can't stop thinking about last night," stared back at me like a knife to the heart. My hands shook as I clicked it open. There it was, undeniable proof in black and white. Months of correspondence with another woman, sweet nothings, intimate details, plans to meet in hotels that I had never even heard him mention before. It wasn't just an affair. It was a double life. My world tilted on its axis in that moment, and for hours I just sat on the couch, staring at the screen, trying to reconcile the man I married with the liar I had discovered. Filing for divorce wasn't a choice I made lightly. I am not the kind of person who gives up easily. And part of me wanted to scream, to confront him, to demand explanations until there were no words left to give. But another part of me, the part that had quietly endured his distance for years, knew that forgiveness would only mean sacrificing myself further. So I called an attorney, met with her in a quiet office downtown, and started the paperwork. Signing my name at the bottom of those pages was both the most painful and the most liberating act of my life. I didn't plan on sharing the papers with anyone right away. Divorce carries stigma, especially in my family. My parents were married for 40 years before my dad passed away, and in their eyes, marriage was sacred, something you fought for no matter how ugly it became. I had always been the good daughter, the one who played by the rules, who made choices they could be proud of. So when the attorney emailed me the official scanned copy of the divorce petition, I saved it in a folder and stared at it for days, wondering how long I could keep the secret. It was late on a Thursday evening when the moment came. I was exhausted after a long day of work, emotionally drained from juggling my students' problems while my own life was falling apart. The family group chat pinged on my phone. My mom had sent a blurry photo of her garden tomatoes. My younger brother Kyle responded with a sarcastic gif. My in-law chimed in about weekend plans. And there I was, sitting in silence, staring at that scanned file. My finger hovered over the screen for longer than I can remember. Then, almost like a reflex, I hit share, attaching the document without any explanation, just letting the words "divorce papers served" speak for themselves. My heart raced the moment it sent. It felt impulsive, reckless even, but also like I had finally ripped off a Band-Aid. Within seconds, the little gray dots appeared at the bottom of the screen. Someone was typing. It was my mom. I braced myself for her to tell me I was being dramatic, to lecture me about commitment, to remind me of my vows. Instead, what came through on the screen made my stomach drop and my vision blur. Her words weren't of comfort or disapproval. They were something so shocking, so revealing, that in an instant I realized everything I thought I knew about my family, my childhood, and even my marriage had been built on secrets too heavy for one message to contain. That moment was the beginning of a storm I couldn't stop, and it's what I'll carry you through now, step by step, as the truth unraveled and left me with a choice I never expected to face. In the days leading up to that fateful group chat message, my life had already begun to unravel in ways I didn't want to admit to anyone, not even myself. If part one was the breaking point, then what I'm about to share is the reality of the world I had been living in, the toxic status quo that I had grown accustomed to, the hidden problems I worked so hard to conceal behind smiles and small talk. Looking back now, I can see just how much of my identity was swallowed up in maintaining appearances, even when my own happiness was slipping away like water through my hands. Mark and I had built our life together in a quiet suburb of Dayton, a neighborhood filled with manicured lawns and families who waved politely as they passed each other on evening walks. From the outside, our home was just another two-story colonial with white shutters and a red door. Inside, though, it was a house filled with silence and tension. When we first bought it, we had imagined it brimming with children's laughter and holiday dinners with relatives crowded around the table. But those dreams never materialized. I had wanted children desperately, but Mark always had an excuse. His career wasn't stable yet, the house wasn't big enough, we didn't have enough savings. Each year that passed, I convinced myself to wait a little longer, until waiting became a silent agreement neither of us addressed. At work, I was the steady hand my students depended on. As a high school guidance counselor, I dealt daily with teenagers in crisis, heartbreak, academic struggles, family drama, mental health battles. I became a master at compartmentalizing. I would listen intently, offer advice, encourage resilience, and then drive home with my own chest heavy, dreading the moment I walked through the front door. It was a cruel irony that I could guide young people through their storms, but couldn't find the courage to face my own. The hidden problem wasn't just Mark's affair. That was the climax of years of deception. The deeper truth was that our relationship had been crumbling long before I discovered his emails. Mark had slowly withdrawn from me piece by piece over the years. At first it was subtle. Skipped date nights, forgotten anniversaries, weekends too busy with work. Then it became obvious. Separate bank accounts he insisted were easier for budgeting, late nights that stretched into early mornings, trips I wasn't invited on because they were just for clients. I asked questions, but he always had smooth answers that made me feel guilty for doubting him. Somewhere along the way, I started to believe him more than I believed myself. My coping mechanism was to bury myself in routine. I woke up at 6 a.m. sharp, made coffee, prepared a simple breakfast, drove to school, counseled students, stayed late grading scholarship essays or writing recommendation letters. I filled my evenings with chores, laundry, meal prepping, reorganizing closets that didn't need reorganizing, anything to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander into the dark spaces where doubts lived. Friends would invite me out, but I often declined, claiming exhaustion, when in reality, I didn't want anyone to see through the cracks in my carefully curated life. Family gatherings were the hardest. My mom, Helen, was the glue of the Miller clan, always insisting we gather at her house for Sunday dinners. She would bustle around the kitchen, serving roast chicken or lasagna, while my younger brother, Kyle, cracked jokes, and my sister-in-law, Emily, fussed over their 2 little boys.
Inevitably, someone would ask when Mark and I were going to start a family of our own. I'd force a smile, sip my wine, and say something vague like, "We're just waiting for the right time." Inside, though, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut because I knew the right time was never coming. Mark had made sure of that. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But even worse than the questions about children was the unspoken comparison between Mark and my late father. My dad, Richard Miller, had been a hardworking man, a quiet giant who adored my mother and raised us with steady discipline and unconditional love. After his death 5 years ago, my mother often said Mark reminded her of him, strong, dependable, the kind of man a woman could lean on. Hearing her say that always made me swallow back a lump of guilt because I knew the truth was the opposite. Mark was nothing like my father. My father would have never lied, never neglected, never betrayed. And yet I let her believe it because the alternative would have been to admit how wrong I was about everything. There were moments when I considered leaving long before the affair came to light. Nights when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was really all there was for me. But every time, fear held me back. Fear of being alone, fear of judgment, fear of disappointing my mother, who had sacrificed so much to give me a stable life. In her world, marriage was sacred, a value you didn't walk away from just because things got hard. I could already hear her voice in my head. "Jessica, you just need to be patient. Men go through phases. Don't throw away your marriage over something small." The irony was that what she thought would be small was the weight that was crushing me every single day.
So I stayed. I put on a brave face. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. I smiled for photos that made it look like we were happy. I endured the quiet dinners, the absent husband, the gnawing loneliness that followed me into every corner of our home. That was the hidden problem, the toxic reality of my life before the group chat message, a slow erosion of trust, affection, and self-worth that I learned to survive by pretending it wasn't there. And yet, even in all of that, I had no idea just how deep the deception went. I thought Mark's betrayal was the worst secret I would ever uncover. I thought the divorce papers were the biggest shock my family would ever have to process. But I was wrong. The moment my mom replied to that message, I would realize the truth I had been living in wasn't just about my marriage. It was about my family, my past, and everything I thought I could rely on. The stage was set for a revelation I never could have prepared for. The breaking point came swiftly, with a force that made it impossible to keep pretending everything was fine. For years, I had lived inside a quiet storm of doubts, excuses, and avoidance. But there's always a moment when the walls you've built to contain the truth can't hold up any longer. Mine came on a rainy Saturday morning in early spring. Mark had claimed he needed to drive to Cincinnati for an overnight business trip. It wasn't unusual. He often disappeared for stretches of time with vague explanations about client dinners and networking events. But something about the way he packed that morning, the hasty shoving of cloves into a bag, the way he avoided looking me in the eye, set off alarms in my chest. I told myself to let it go, but my hands trembled as I picked up my phone and, against my better judgment, opened the GPS tracker I had once installed on his car under the guise of safety. I had almost forgotten it was there. What I saw made my blood run cold. Mark hadn't driven south towards Cincinnati at all. Instead, his car was parked at a mid-range hotel on the other side of Dayton. My first reaction was denial. Maybe he stopped for coffee. Maybe he got tired of driving. But as the hours stretched on, the dot on the screen never moved. He wasn't working. He wasn't networking. He was staying in that hotel, and I knew deep down he wasn't staying there alone. I drove past the hotel that afternoon, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I didn't stop. I couldn't bear to see it with my own eyes. But even passing by, knowing his car was sitting in that log while he played house with someone else,
was enough to shatter whatever illusion of marriage I had left. I went home and sat in silence, the sound of rain tapping against the windows like an endless drumbeat. I wanted to scream, to cry, to call someone. But instead, I sat numb, staring at the walls of a house that no longer felt like my own. By Sunday morning, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I printed out the emails I had found weeks earlier, spread them across the dining table, and stared at the evidence of betrayal in front of me. Each line of affection he had written to another woman was like a dagger, cutting into the fragile narrative I had built for myself. There was no saving this. There was no forgiving this. The decision was made for me. Divorce was no longer an option to consider. It was the only path left. Still, even after contacting my attorney and signing the papers, I kept it to myself. Part of me wanted to protect my family from the pain and humiliation. My mother had always idealized Mark, and I dreaded the disappointment in her eyes. For weeks, I carried the secret like a stone in my chest, pretending to go about my daily routine while inside I was crumbling. But secrets have a way of demanding to be revealed, and mine chose the most unexpected moment to surface. The group chat had always been a lifeline for our family, a way to stay connected after my father passed. My mom, Kyle, Emily, and I used it for everything, sharing recipes, arranging family dinners, posting silly photos of the nephews. It was lighthearted, easy, a place where we could rely on each other for laughs or encouragement. That night, when my phone buzzed with a notification, I wasn't thinking clearly. I had been staring at the divorce papers for hours, the digital file open on my laptop like it was mocking me. My nerves were raw, my patience gone. When the chat came alive with chatter about weekend plans, something in me snapped. Without typing a single word, I hit attach, selected the file, and pressed send. The moment it went through, a rush of adrenaline coursed through me, quickly followed by dread. I stared at the screen, watching the little gray dots dance as my mom typed. My chest tightened. What was I doing? I had skipped every step of explanation, every attempt at easing them into it. Instead, I had dropped a bomb in the middle of our family's safe space. For a brief second, I imagined my mom would type words of comfort, perhaps something like, "Jessica, come over, we'll talk about this." Or maybe she'd call me immediately, her voice heavy with worry but full of support. But when her message appeared, it was nothing like I expected. Instead of asking questions or offering comfort, her words cut through me with a sharpness that made me gasp aloud. She wrote, "You don't know half the truth about your marriage, Jessica, and maybe it's time you finally did." I sat frozen, staring at the screen as if I had misread it. What did she mean I didn't know half the truth? My heart pounded, my hands shook. Within seconds, Kyle chimed in, confused, asking Mom what she meant. Emily sent a string of question marks. I just sat there, unable to type, unable to breathe. My mother's words lingered on the screen, heavy and ominous, carrying a weight that threatened to crush me. It wasn't pity, it wasn't scolding, it was something else entirely, something darker. In that moment, I realized the breaking point wasn't just my husband's betrayal or even the act of serving him divorce papers. The breaking point was the sudden, horrifying possibility that my marriage wasn't the only lie I had been living with. My mother knew something I didn't. And by sending that file, I had accidentally ripped open a door I didn't even know existed. That night, I lay awake in bed, my phone clutched in my hand, rereading her words over and over until they blurred. "You don't know half the truth about your marriage, Jessica." It echoed in my head, refusing to let me rest. My world had already been unsteadied, but now it felt like the ground beneath me was collapsing entirely. Whatever secrets my mother was hinting at, I knew they were going to change everything. The days after my mother's cryptic response in the group chat passed in a haze, a strange mix of dread and urgency gnawing at me from the inside out. I couldn't stop replaying those words over and over. "You don't know half the truth about your marriage, Jessica, and maybe it's time you finally did." They haunted me at work, they echoed in my dreams, and they colored every interaction I had with my family. It wasn't just the betrayal of Mark anymore. It was the sense that there was a shadow looming behind the betrayal, some darker thread woven through my life that I had been blind to. And now that my mother had hinted at it, I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard. For 2 days, I avoided her calls. She rang me 4 times, each time leaving a voicemail that was careful, measured, almost rehearsed. "Jessica, we should talk. Please don't let this sit too long. You need to know what I mean." Each time I heard her voice, my stomach twisted. I wanted answers, but I was afraid of them. I wasn't sure which would be worse, that she was exaggerating in some misguided attempt to distract me from my pain, or that she was telling the absolute truth and everything I thought I knew was about to be destroyed. The first outside eyes to catch the thread of truth weren't even mine. It was my brother Kyle. He showed up at my house unannounced the following Saturday afternoon, knocking hard on the door like he used to when we were kids. When I opened it, he walked in without waiting for an invitation, his face serious, his usual playful smirk gone. "Jess," he said, sitting heavily on the couch, "what did Mom mean by that? She won't tell me. She just says she'll explain it when you're ready. But I can't stop thinking about it. What don't you know?" I sat across from him, wrapping my arms around myself like they could shield me from the questions. "I don't know, Kyle," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I really don't. But the way she said it, she knows something. And I can't tell if I'm ready to find out." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on mine. "Then we have to be ready, because she's not bluffing. You saw her message. She meant it." Later that evening, as if on cue, my mom arrived at my house. I hadn't invited her, but she must have known I wouldn't come to her, not after everything. She walked in carrying a folder, her face pale but determined. Kyle and I sat waiting, the tension so thick it felt like breathing was an effort. She set the folder on the table without a word at first, then sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a long moment she didn't speak, just stared at her fingers, and I thought I might scream from the silence. Finally, she said, "Jessica, the man you married isn't who you think he is, and I should have told you long before now." The words cracked something inside me. I wanted to demand details, to shake her until she explained, but all I could do was whisper, "What do you mean?" She looked up then, her eyes wet, and I saw not just sadness, but guilt etched into her face. "Mark wasn't a stranger when you met him. He wasn't just some charming man you fell in love with. I knew him before you ever did, and I knew things about him that I should have warned you about." Kyle swore under his breath, leaning back as if the revelation had physically shoved him. I sat frozen, my heart hammering. My mom reached for the folder, opening it with trembling hands. Inside were photos, old newspaper clippings, and what looked like court documents. She pushed them across the table toward me. My hands shook as I picked up the first clipping. It was a grainy article from nearly a decade ago, about a financial fraud case involving a company in Cincinnati. The name Mark Whitman was printed in bold in the second paragraph.
I blinked, reading the words again and again, unable to reconcile the man who had shared my bed with the man described in the article. Fraudulent contracts, embezzled funds, testimony from coworkers who claimed he lied and manipulated his way into positions of power. According to the clipping, charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the stain remained. My hands shook as I put it down and grabbed another paper, this one a court document about a restraining order filed by a woman I didn't recognize. Allegations of harassment, threats, stalking. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, tears burning my eyes. My mom's hands twisted in her lap. "Because I thought people could change. Because when you introduced him to me all those years ago, he swore he had left all that behind. And because you looked at him the way I once looked at your father, with hope, with love. I didn't want to shatter that. I convinced myself it was all in the past. But Jessica, I was wrong. I should have told you." Kyle exploded then, his anger filling the room. "Mom, you let her marry him? You knew what kind of man he was and you let her walk into it blind?"
My mother's shoulders sagged under the weight of his words, but she didn't argue. She just looked at me with eyes full of regret. The outside eyes had seen the truth now. Kyle, myself, even my mom's reluctant confession had brought light into the shadows I had been living in. The red flags I had ignored in my marriage weren't just signs of infidelity or distance. They were echoes of a past pattern, a man who had been deceiving long before he ever met me. And now, with the evidence sitting in front of me, the cover-up was failing. There was no denying it anymore. Mark wasn't who I thought he was. He never had been. And my mother, who I had trusted more than anyone, had kept the truth from me until it was too late. After that night, when my mother laid the folder on my table and shattered what little stability I had left, I couldn't bring myself to just let it rest. If Mark had this history of deception and fraud, if there were court documents and articles tying his name to lies long before he ever became my husband, then I needed to know the full scope. It wasn't enough to be told pieces. I needed the whole picture. My mother's guilty eyes and my brother's outrage weren't enough to answer the questions now gnawing at me. And so began the most grueling phase of this ordeal, gathering evidence. I spent nights combing through old records online. I pored over court archives, news articles, and business databases. What began as a trickle of information turned into an avalanche. It seemed that Mark had spent his 20s and early 30s building a reputation for charm and ambition, only for it to collapse in scandal after scandal. There were whispers of business partners swindled, investments that vanished overnight, and legal battles settled out of court. His name wasn't always front and center. Sometimes it was tucked into a footnote, other times buried in a witness statement. But it was there, and each mention was another crack in the facade of the man I thought I had known. What disturbed me most were the patterns. He had a way of ingratiating himself into circles of trust, friends, coworkers, partners, before exploiting them. He would reinvent himself, move cities, start again with a clean slate. By the time I met him, he had already cycled through at least 2 different lives, and I was just another chapter in his book of reinventions. The realization made me sick. Every anniversary photo, every holiday memory, every whispered "I love you" now felt like props in a performance carefully staged to keep me blind. But digging into his past wasn't just about facts and records. It was also about confronting my own conflicted feelings. There were moments when I wanted to slam the laptop shut and stop. There were nights I wept, curled up on the couch, asking myself why I was torturing myself with details that only deepened the hurt. Yet some stubborn part of me refused to stop. If I didn't face it now, I knew I would never be free of it. But the opposition wasn't idle. Mark had noticed something was changing in me. Though we were already separated in spirit, still living under the same roof for practical reasons, he could sense the distance turning into hostility. He asked questions: why I seemed cold, why I was always glued to my computer. His eyes narrowed when he caught me quickly closing a tab one night. "What are you doing?" he demanded. I brushed it off as work, but suspicion flickered in his gaze. Then the intimidation began. He didn't scream, didn't lash out violently. That wasn't his style. Instead, he employed subtle tactics that made my skin crawl. He reminded me of how intertwined our finances were, how messy things would get if I tried to take him to court. He brought up debts I didn't know about, investments I supposedly benefited from, hinting that I might be dragged into his mess. At dinner one night, he leaned close and said quietly, "You really don't want to dig too deep into things you don't understand." The threat was veiled, but it landed like a punch.
I confided in Kyle about these moments, and he immediately urged me to move out, to put distance between myself and Mark before things escalated. But moving out wasn't simple. Our mortgage was joint, our accounts tangled, and my job kept me tied to the city. The logistics felt like chains binding me to him, even as I uncovered more proof of his lies. In the meantime, my mom oscillated between guilt and support. She began feeding me pieces of information she had withheld before, trying to make up for lost time. She admitted that years ago, when Mark first came around, she had confronted him privately. He had looked her straight in the eye, promised her he had changed, and begged her not to poison his relationship with me. She had believed him, or at least wanted to believe him, and kept silent. Now, her regret spilled out in late-night phone calls, her voice cracking as she confessed her failure to protect me. The deeper I dug, the more the tension grew. Evidence was piling up, financial documents showing unexplained withdrawals, testimonies from old colleagues who described him as manipulative, records of lawsuits that ended in settlements. Each piece was a nail in the coffin of the illusion I had lived in for 7 years. But each piece also seemed to make Mark more agitated, more desperate to maintain control. He started watching me closely, questioning my every move. At times, I felt like I was living with a stranger whose mask was slowly slipping, revealing the darker man underneath. And yet, even as the opposition mounted, I wrestled with myself. Part of me still hesitated to reveal the truth fully. To my students at school, to friends who still thought I had a happy marriage, to extended family members who adored Mark, I was still keeping up appearances. The shame was suffocating. How could I admit that I, the guidance counselor who preached honesty and resilience, had been duped so thoroughly in my own life? I worried about the judgment, the whispers, the pitying looks. So I kept it close, confiding only in Kyle and my mom, even as the pressure built around me. It felt like standing in the eye of a storm. Evidence swirling around me, opposition pressing in from all sides, and me at the center, trying to decide whether I had the strength to bring it all into the light. But deep down, I knew the storm was only getting stronger, and soon I would be forced to choose between silence and truth. The moment of undeniable proof came one late Friday night when the house was silent, the only sound being the faint hum of the refrigerator and the clicking of my laptop keys. I had grown used to living in this kind of twilight existence, searching records after work while Mark pretended to sleep on the other side of the house. That night, however, the search took me somewhere I hadn't expected, into an old case file from a different state, years before I even met him. It was buried in a digital archive, half redacted, but there in bold letters was his name, unmistakable and damning. The charge wasn't just financial fraud. It was fraud tied directly to a family trust. He had siphoned funds from relatives who had trusted him to manage their inheritance. Worse, there were depositions attached, and in one of them, his own cousin swore under oath that Mark had forged signatures to secure loans against property he didn't own. I remember staring at the screen, feeling the blood drain from my face. This wasn't rumor or hearsay. This was fact, court-documented and undeniable. I printed the file in shaking hands, page after page spilling onto the tray until I had a stack thick enough to weigh down my dining table. Looking at it, I realized my husband wasn't just someone with a shady past. He was a man who had deliberately, repeatedly, and unapologetically taken advantage of people who loved him. It was the confirmation I needed, the tipping point that severed the last threads of hope I had been clinging to. Yet with that clarity came a fresh wave of dread. If he had done this to his own blood, what had he planned for me? The weight of the discovery was crushing, and I knew I couldn't carry it alone. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house with a stack of papers in my arms. She sat at the kitchen table in her robe, sipping coffee, her face drawn and tired. When I laid the documents in front of her, she didn't even reach for them at first. She just closed her eyes, pressing her lips together as if bracing for a blow. Then, she opened the top page and began reading. Her hands trembled, her breath caught in her throat. "Oh, Emily," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I didn't want this for you." Kyle joined us soon after, and the three of us pored over the evidence together. For the first time, I saw not just my mother's guilt, but her anger. Raw, unfiltered anger that Mark had manipulated not just me, but her too, into silence.
That night, as if fate had conspired to push everything to a breaking point, Mark confronted me directly.
He must have noticed the missing papers from his files or sensed the shift in me because he cornered me in the hallway. His smile was tight, his tone calm, but his eyes were like steel. "You've been digging," he said simply. I froze, clutching the folder in my arms like a shield. He tilted his head, studying me, before adding, "You think you know everything, but you don't. And if you keep this up, you're going to ruin yourself." It wasn't the words alone, but the way he said them, quiet, deliberate, like a chess player explaining his winning move, that terrified me. For the first time, I saw not the charming husband I once adored, but a man stripped bare of his facade, revealing the predator beneath. I didn't answer him that night. I pushed past him, locked myself in the bedroom, and cried into my pillow until the sun came up. But even as fear gnawed at me, something else was taking root. Resolve. I finally had what I needed, not just for myself, but for legal grounds. It was no longer just about emotional betrayal. It was about criminal behavior, a documented history of deceit that painted a picture too dark to ignore. At work that week, I was a ghost of myself. My students noticed my distraction, my colleagues whispered in concern, but I couldn't share the storm raging inside me. During lunch breaks, I slipped away to call lawyers, each consultation confirming what I already knew. This marriage wasn't salvageable, and the safest path forward was to protect myself legally and financially before Mark could manipulate the system against me. Some lawyers warned that men like him, practiced liars with experience in courts, were dangerous opponents. That warning alone kept me awake at night, but it also hardened my will. Meanwhile, the group chat that had once been the stage for my impulsive announcement was growing restless. Friends messaged me privately, asking what was going on, why I had dropped such a bomb and then gone quiet. I ignored most of them, but in my silence, I could sense the rumors swirling. Part of me wanted to shout the truth from the rooftops, to expose Mark publicly so no one else would fall for his act. But the cautious part of me knew that timing mattered, that if I moved too soon, I might give him the chance to twist the story in his favor. The true turning point came a few days later when my mother called me, her voice calm but steady, and said, "Emily, it's time you stop thinking about protecting his image. You have proof now. Use it." Hearing her say that, after weeks of guilt and regret, was like a balm. It gave me permission to stop shielding Mark with my silence. It gave me the strength to prepare for the battle ahead. I began compiling everything: court documents, financial records, testimonies, even texts that hinted at his manipulation. Each piece went into a binder I labeled simply Truth. It was my weapon, my safeguard, and my lifeline. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that he would fight back with everything he had, but for the first time since the nightmare began, I wasn't stumbling in the dark. I had undeniable proof, and with it, a glimmer of power. What I didn't realize was that having proof wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the midpoint, and from here, things would escalate in ways I could never have anticipated. After assembling the binder of irrefutable evidence, the moment came when I had to make a choice that I had been avoiding for months, whether to finally speak out and confront Mark with everything I had uncovered. The fear of the unknown clawed at me like a relentless tide. This wasn't just about ending a marriage anymore. This was about exposing a man who had deceived everyone around him for years, a man who would fight tooth and nail to preserve the illusion of innocence. My nights were sleepless, plagued with visions of courtroom battles, family confrontations, and the inevitable fallout that would come from dragging his hidden life into the light. Every scenario I imagined was terrifying, yet beneath the fear was a thread of determination that had been quietly strengthening with each revelation. I could no longer hide. I started with my mother. Over coffee at her kitchen table, I laid out the binder again, this time showing her everything in detail. Her hands shook as she leafed through the documents, reading aloud some of the damning testimonies and financial records. "Emily," she said, her voice quivering, "you have no idea how long I've been trying to keep you safe from this. I thought I could manage it, that you'd never have to see him for who he really is. But now you have the right to fight back." Her words, though tinged with regret, gave me the courage I needed. She had once protected me by keeping the truth hidden, but now she was lending me her strength. That night, Kyle joined us as well, and together we formed a small circle of support that felt unshakable, even in the face of what was to come.
The first confrontation with Mark was almost surreal. I waited until the house was quiet, the children next door asleep, and I found him in the living room scrolling through his phone. He looked up, surprised to see me standing there, binder in hand. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "Mark, we need to talk," I said, and the calm I tried to summon barely masked the storm beneath. His expression shifted, from surprise to something sharper, something like wariness. "What is this about?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. I opened the binder and set it on the coffee table. The pages rustled like dry leaves, and I watched him freeze as he scanned the first few documents. I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I didn't waver. I just let the evidence speak. His reaction was subtle at first. He leaned back, brows furrowed, as though trying to buy time while formulating a response. Then the calm cracked. "You don't understand these things," he snapped, his voice rising. "Everything in here is old. It's irrelevant. It doesn't apply to us." But I had anticipated this. I pressed on, methodically detailing how each item demonstrated a pattern of deceit and manipulation, and how it directly connected to the way he treated me and the control he exerted over our marriage. I could see the fight leaving him, replaced by a thin veneer of panic. For the first time, the man who had once been so untouchable seemed exposed, vulnerable. After that night, I knew I couldn't stop at a private confrontation. The evidence had to be seen by those who mattered most: my family, the legal authorities, and ultimately anyone who could ensure that justice prevailed. I informed my attorney and began drafting formal complaints, armed with everything in the binder. Each step I took was deliberate, calculated, and increasingly tense. Mark's tactics of intimidation escalated. He would linger near my workspace, make pointed comments about my credibility, and subtly threaten the fallout of going public. Every day felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. One misstep could unravel the fragile progress I had made. Despite the pressure, I found myself feeling an unexpected sense of liberation. Speaking the truth, even when it terrified me, was a strange kind of relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't pretending. I wasn't bending reality to fit someone else's version of the world. Each piece of evidence I presented, each conversation I initiated, each phone call to lawyers or family members reinforced my sense that I was finally reclaiming agency over my life. Still, there were emotional costs. Friends who had long admired my supposed perfect marriage were shocked and judgmental. Some turned away, unable to reconcile the image they had of Mark with the man I was exposing. Family members, initially supportive, struggled with their own doubts and fears, questioning whether I was overreacting or misinterpreting the evidence. Even my mother, who had been my steadfast ally, seemed haunted by her earlier silence, struggling to come to terms with the role she had unknowingly played in allowing the deception to persist. The tipping point came one evening when I organized a family meeting to present the evidence in person. My mother, Kyle, Emily, and even a few close friends gathered, and I laid the binder on the dining table like a gauntlet thrown. Each page revealed not just Mark's betrayals, but a pattern that could not be denied. His casual charm, the lies, the manipulations, all laid bare in black and white. The room was silent for a long, tense moment. Mark sat there, flushed and cornered, and for the first time I saw the mask he had worn for so many years crumble completely. The truth was undeniable, and the silence that followed was heavy with its weight. By the end of that night, the choice I had been dreading was no longer abstract. I had stopped protecting him. I had chosen to speak, to expose, to confront.
The allies I had quietly cultivated, my mother, my brother, my closest friends, were all watching now, their support giving me strength even as the fallout loomed. Old loyalties were tested, the fragility of relationships exposed, but the path forward had been set. I had crossed the point of no return, and the secret that had held me captive for so long was finally out in the open. Once I had spoken and revealed the binder to my family, the tension in the house shifted from private anxiety to almost tangible, oppressive force. Mark no longer tried subtle intimidation. His control tactics became direct and confrontational, a full-scale assault on my sense of stability. Every day brought new challenges, passive-aggressive comments, veiled threats, and sudden arguments designed to wear me down. He began questioning my credibility at work, calling and emailing my supervisor under the guise of concern about my professional judgment, attempting to sow seeds of doubt and fear in spaces where I once felt secure. Each confrontation was a test of endurance, a deliberate attempt to undermine me while keeping up a facade of normalcy for anyone else who might be watching.
The mounting pressure escalated quickly when he discovered I had contacted a private investigator to verify the details in the binder. That evening, he cornered me in the kitchen, slamming his hand against the counter, eyes wild. "Do you think you can ruin me and get away with it?" he hissed. The binder sat on the table between us like a shield, the weight of truth pressing into both our presences. I refused to step back, my voice steady even as my heart raced. "I'm not ruining you, Mark. I'm exposing what you've been hiding for years. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability." His laughter was sharp, unhinged, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Accountability? You don't even know the half of it. If you try to drag me through the mud, I'll make sure everyone believes you're the liar here." I could see the shift in his demeanor. Calculated fear mixed with aggression, something that told me he knew the truth I held was powerful enough to destroy him. It was no longer just a personal confrontation. This was a battle of narratives, a war to control perception. Every interaction with him after that felt like walking through a minefield. He would follow me with questions, insinuations, and carefully crafted manipulations, attempting to destabilize my emotional footing. At times, I doubted myself, wondering if he could twist the story enough to turn my family, my friends, or even the legal system against me. My mother's support became even more critical during this period. She began documenting her own encounters with him, writing down incidents she had observed over the years that corroborated the evidence in the binder. Kyle, too, stepped in, providing logistical support, installing additional security measures in my home, accompanying me to meetings, and reinforcing my resolve whenever Mark tried to intimidate me. Emily handled the communications side, fielding phone calls and messages that were clearly attempts by Mark to manipulate or frighten me. Together, we formed a network that countered his attempts to isolate me, but the pressure remained relentless. The confrontation reached a new level when Mark attempted to enlist our mutual friends in his campaign to discredit me. He called, texted, and even showed up unannounced, painting a picture of a frustrated, unstable wife who was exaggerating and fabricating claims for attention and leverage. Friends I had trusted for years were caught in the crossfire, unsure whether to believe me or the charismatic man they had always admired. I found myself facing the dual challenge of maintaining my credibility while simultaneously presenting undeniable evidence that could withstand scrutiny from anyone he might try to sway. One night, the intensity of the situation peaked. Mark followed me home from a meeting with my attorney, his presence silent but suffocating. I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my neck, and when I turned, he smiled coldly. "You think these papers protect you? They don't. I can make sure the court sees it my way. I'll make you look like the crazy one, the one everyone doubts." The words, though thinly veiled as concern, carried a menace that made my chest tighten. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just dealing with infidelity or betrayal anymore. I was confronting a man who was willing to manipulate, threaten, and distort reality to preserve his own freedom. Even as he intensified his pressure, I found moments of clarity. Each threat, each confrontation reinforced why I had made the choice to speak.
This wasn't about revenge, it was about survival and justice. I doubled down on my efforts, meticulously cataloging interactions, saving messages, and reinforcing the chain of evidence. I met with attorneys who confirmed the strength of the documentation, and I began preparing for the inevitable legal proceedings. The binder that had once been a tool of personal clarity now became my armor, a tangible collection of proof that I could rely on even when Mark's words and presence sought to undermine me. The confrontation reached a public crescendo at a family gathering, one that Mark had insisted on attending despite the tension. Surrounded by relatives who had long admired him, he attempted to charm his way back into the narrative, presenting himself as calm and rational while subtly casting doubt on me. But I had rehearsed my position, armed with both evidence and the support of my mother, Kyle, and Emily. With each piece of truth I presented, with each calm but firm response to his manipulations, the mask he had so carefully constructed began to crumble in front of everyone. Friends I had trusted for years were caught in the crossfire, unsure whether to believe me or the charismatic man they had always admired. I found myself facing the dual challenge of maintaining my credibility while simultaneously presenting undeniable evidence that could withstand scrutiny from anyone he might try to sway. By the end of that confrontation, the mounting pressure had shifted. No longer was I merely a target, I had become a force, exposing deception and demanding accountability. The battles were far from over, but the balance of power had begun to tilt. Mark's influence was waning, and the reality of his actions, once hidden, was now confronting him at every turn. It was a tense, dangerous moment, but it was also one of triumph. The truth, finally, had begun to break through the web of lies.
After the confrontation with Mark and the partial exposure of his deception to family and friends, the weight of consequences hit me like a tidal wave, crushing the fragile sense of control I had painstakingly built. The backlash was immediate and merciless, a storm that struck from every direction. Word of the confrontation had spread faster than I anticipated. Friends who had once been neutral now whispered behind my back, some questioning my judgment, others refusing to take sides at all. Even those I had expected to support me seemed hesitant, unsure whether to trust the narrative of a wife exposing a husband they had long admired. The isolation felt suffocating. Suddenly, the network I thought I had built began to feel porous, riddled with cracks where doubt and suspicion seeped in. Mark, sensing vulnerability, escalated his manipulation. He began contacting colleagues and acquaintances with a narrative of his own, painting me as irrational, unstable, and vengeful. Emails, phone calls, and even social media messages arrived at my work, casting shadows over my professional reputation. My students noticed the change in me, the tightness in my voice, the fatigue in my eyes. The counselor who had always been a source of guidance now felt like a fragile woman walking through a minefield. Every day, I battled not only the external consequences of Mark's attacks, but also the creeping self-doubt that came with them. Was I overreacting? Was I misinterpreting his actions? The questions gnawed at me relentlessly, making every interaction a test of my resolve. The pressure didn't stop at social backlash. Legal complications emerged, threatening to drain both my finances and emotional energy. Mark's lawyers responded to the evidence I had gathered with counterclaims, vague accusations, and demands that I account for every document in the binder. The court system, while impartial in theory, felt like a cold, distant machine, and I feared that my husband's practiced charm and manipulative skills could sway opinions in subtle but damaging ways. Each meeting with my attorney left me exhausted, mentally frayed, and emotionally raw. I felt like a soldier in a war where the enemy knew every trick in the book, and I was constantly on the defensive. Home, which had once been my sanctuary, became a site of unease. Mark's presence was oppressive, his silent glances loaded with menace, and his casual remarks laced with threat. He would linger near my workspace, asking pointed questions, questioning my actions, and reminding me of entanglements that could be used against me. Even the simple act of cooking dinner or checking mail felt fraught with tension, as though I were navigating a house laced with invisible tripwires. The emotional toll was immense. Nights were sleepless, punctuated by nightmares of confrontation and humiliation. Days were tense,
each interaction a potential escalation. The combination of social backlash, legal pressure, and constant surveillance left me mentally and physically depleted. There were moments when I questioned whether all of this was worth it. The temptation to retreat, to quietly pack up my life and disappear, whispered insidiously in the quiet hours of the night. I thought about the comfort of ignoring the truth, of pretending everything was normal and hoping the storm would pass. But each time I considered it, I remembered the binder, the undeniable evidence, and my mother's words. You deserve the truth, and the truth deserves to be heard. That thought alone reignited my resolve. I couldn't abandon the path I had started. I owed it to myself, to my children, to anyone else who might unknowingly become a victim of Mark's manipulations. Emotionally, I hit a low point I never imagined I could endure. Isolation gnawed at me, leaving me desperate for connection, yet wary of whom to trust. I avoided calls and texts from friends who seemed to hesitate in taking my side, fearing the potential fallout if Mark's narrative reached them first. Even my mother's support, though unwavering, was tinged with guilt, reminding me that no one was free from the weight of deception. The constant vigilance, the emotional labor of defending myself, and the fear of losing credibility all converged into a dark, suffocating cloud. I felt paralyzed, trapped between the desire to fight and the instinct to flee, unsure if speaking the truth had been worth the pain it unleashed. The backlash wasn't just external, it was internal as well. I wrestled with guilt over my inability to protect my own sense of security and the regret for ever having trusted someone so thoroughly. I replayed moments in my mind, analyzing every decision, every lapse in judgment, every sign I had missed. I questioned whether I had been naive, foolish, or simply unlucky. The emotional weight was unbearable, and I found myself lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the storm would ever end, or if I was destined to live in this state of constant vigilance and anxiety. And yet, in the midst of that darkness, a flicker of clarity emerged. I realized that the backlash, as painful and isolating as it was proof that I had struck at the heart of deception. Mark's attacks, the doubts cast by friends, the legal complications, they were the reactions of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. The emotional and social cost was steep, but it was also the necessary price of revealing the truth. I began to see that my endurance, my resilience, and my courage were being tested in ways that would define not just this moment, but the life I would lead after the storm.
By confronting the backlash head-on, by holding my ground despite fear and isolation, I began to glimpse a path forward. I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing to transform this dark night of the soul into a foundation for empowerment. Every insult, every legal threat, every whispered doubt was a piece of the crucible that would forge my strength. Though the emotional and physical toll had reached its peak, I sensed that the most critical phase was about to come. The moment when the truth would be put to trial, when the evidence I had gathered would finally face judgment in a public and undeniable way. The day of the confrontation that would decide everything finally arrived, and I remember waking up with a mixture of dread and resolve that made my chest feel impossibly tight. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering every document, every witness statement, every shred of proof that Mark had tried to bury or erase. The courthouse felt both foreign and sacred, a place where the truth could finally step out of the shadows and stand on its own. I clutched the binder tightly as I walked in, my mother by my side, Kyle behind me, and Emily handling the logistics, all three providing a quiet but powerful support that steadied me in a way I didn't realize I needed until I was standing at the threshold. I knew that what awaited me inside wasn't just a confrontation with Mark. It was a public trial of deception, manipulation, and the years of lies that had defined our marriage. From the moment the proceedings began, the tension was palpable. Mark, sitting across from me, tried to appear calm, but I could see the cracks around his eyes, the slight twitch in his fingers. He had always been good at maintaining a facade, but the weight of undeniable truth was pressing on him like a physical force.
When the first documents were submitted, the binder landing on the judge's desk like a hammer, I watched as his confident expression faltered. The court clerk began to read aloud, detailing patterns of fraud, misrepresentation, and deception that traced back for years. Each revelation was a blow, not just to him, but to the narrative he had worked so hard to maintain. The most significant moment came when witnesses I had quietly contacted over the past weeks took the stand. One by one, former colleagues, business partners, and even a distant cousin recounted their experiences with Mark, confirming the patterns of manipulation and deceit I had meticulously documented. I felt a shiver run through me with each testimony, but also a sense of vindication. Their courage, their willingness to speak the truth, amplified my own, and I realized I was no longer standing alone. The evidence wasn't just paper, it was lived experience, undeniable and compelling. Mark's attempts to defend himself were predictable but feeble. He tried to paint me as biased, unstable, even vengeful. But the weight of the evidence, the consistency of the testimonies, and the clarity of the documentation left little room for his manipulation. I could see the frustration mounting in his jaw, the tightness in his posture. Every argument he made was met with cold facts, hard numbers, and sworn statements that could not be twisted or denied. The courtroom, once a place of intimidating authority, became a stage where the truth shone with a clarity I had not dared to hope for. Throughout the proceedings, I felt waves of emotion, fear, anger, relief, and an unexpected surge of power. I realized that the act of speaking truth, of presenting undeniable evidence, was transforming me. I wasn't just a victim, I was a witness, a crusader for accountability, a woman reclaiming her life from someone who had sought to control it. The binder, once a source of anxiety and tension, had become a symbol of empowerment. Each page, each document, each testimony was a piece of armor, a shield against manipulation, a torch illuminating lies. By mid-afternoon, the climax of the confrontation reached a point that I will never forget. Mark's lawyer attempted a final objection, trying to dismiss a particularly damning financial report as irrelevant. The judge, having carefully reviewed every piece of evidence, overruled the objection. That single moment crystallized everything I had worked for. The truth was not only being acknowledged, but validated. I could feel the weight of months of fear, sleepless nights, and emotional turmoil lifting slightly, replaced by a cautious but undeniable sense of justice. Mark slumped slightly in his chair, the facade of control slipping further as reality set in. When the judge finally allowed me to speak, I rose and addressed the court. My voice was steady, resonant with years of suppressed truth and newfound courage. I recounted my experiences, the manipulations, the lies, the betrayals, and most importantly, I highlighted the documented evidence that supported every word. I felt a sense of release as I spoke, as though each syllable was peeling away the layers of control he had tried to maintain over my life. The court listened, rapt, and for the first time in years, I felt seen, heard, and understood not just by the legal system, but by the world outside my private fears. The reactions were immediate and visceral. Family members who had doubted me nodded, their eyes wide with recognition and relief. Friends who had wavered looked ashamed, but attentive. Even strangers in the courtroom seemed struck by the clarity of the evidence and the sincerity of my testimony. Mark, meanwhile, sat silently, a man confronted by the full weight of the truth he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. His carefully cultivated charm, his manipulative words, his feigned innocence, all were stripped away, leaving only accountability.
By the end of the day, the binder had done its work. The truth had been presented, tested, and validated. The battle was not yet fully over. There were still legal processes to follow, consequences to enforce, but the most critical step had been taken. I had spoken, I had confronted, and I had won acknowledgement of the truth. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of possibility, a glimpse of the life that could exist beyond fear, manipulation, and deceit. The final push had been made, and the foundation for justice and vindication had been firmly laid.
After the courtroom battle, the sense of relief that washed over me was profound, though tempered by the awareness that life wouldn't instantly return to a state of normalcy. Mark's deceptions had been fully exposed, his manipulations brought into the light, and yet the path forward was one that required care, patience, and continued vigilance. The legal system had acknowledged the truth I had painstakingly gathered, confirming that his actions were not just morally wrong, but legally actionable. That validation was transformative. For the first time, I felt a sense of power, an internal shift that allowed me to see myself not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman who had endured emotional torment and emerged stronger, more grounded, and capable of navigating life on her own terms. The first tangible sign of justice came a few weeks later when Mark was formally reprimanded through court rulings and legal enforcement. Financial restitution, mandated disclosures, and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing were on record, leaving him no room to maneuver or hide behind charm. It was a validation not only of the months I had spent gathering evidence, but of the emotional toll I had endured. Seeing the legal consequences unfold, watching the court enforce accountability, reinforced the truth that I had been right to speak up and fight. It was more than victory, it was validation of my courage and resilience. Family dynamics began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. Relatives who had been hesitant now approached me with apologies and understanding, acknowledging that they had underestimated the depth of the deception and the strength required to confront it. My mother, who had been both a protector and an accomplice in silence, began to share her pride in my perseverance. Kyle, who had stood by my side unwaveringly, showed a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that our collective efforts had contributed to a larger triumph. These moments, small but significant, reinforce that truth has a way of restoring balance, not instantaneously, but incrementally, as trust and credibility are rebuilt. Even Mark's former allies, friends who had once admired him or remained neutral, began to distance themselves, leaving him isolated. Witnessing that unraveling was surreal, almost cathartic. It wasn't schadenfreude, it was confirmation that accountability has consequences, and that the deception I had endured was no longer invisible or untouchable. The social web that had once enabled him to manipulate perceptions and control narratives was crumbling, replaced by recognition of the truth I had fought so hard to reveal. That shift in dynamics was empowering. It reminded me that courage has a ripple effect, influencing not only personal circumstances, but the broader environment in which deception operates. With the external battles winding down, I turned inward to process the emotional transformation that had taken place. For years, I had doubted myself, questioned my judgment, and suppressed my instincts in order to maintain appearances. Those patterns had been reinforced by a partner skilled in manipulation, someone who had normalized deceit and gaslighting to the point that my perception of reality had been challenged daily. Emerging from that environment required a reorientation, a reclamation of self-confidence, and a conscious commitment to trusting my own judgment. I began therapy, revisiting the emotional trauma, learning to distinguish fear from instinct, and embracing the power I now held over my own life. It was a painstaking process, but one that solidified the sense of equilibrium I had longed for. Professional life, too, found new balance. Colleagues who had wavered now expressed support and admiration for my resilience, and I regained footing in my career with renewed confidence. The isolation and suspicion that had plagued me began to dissipate, replaced by meaningful connections built on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. That shift underscored a critical lesson. Exposing the truth is not only about confronting external deception, but about cultivating spaces where integrity and transparency are recognized and valued. The equilibrium I was building wasn't just personal, it extended into my broader social and professional life, reinforcing the impact of courage on multiple levels. One of the most poignant moments came when I revisited the binder, the same one that had been my armor and my lifeline during the darkest months. I realized that the documents were no longer just proof of wrongdoing, they had become symbols of transformation, of resilience, of a journey from fear and uncertainty to empowerment and clarity. I placed it carefully on a shelf, a reminder of the battle fought and the victory earned, a tangible representation of the power of truth. It was no longer a source of anxiety or dread, it was a testament to the strength required to confront deception head-on and emerge victorious.
As days turned into weeks, I began to envision a future that had seemed impossible during the months of confrontation. Plans for independence, emotional restoration, and rebuilding personal relationships took shape. I reconnected with friends who had supported me quietly, established new boundaries with family members, and consciously prioritized spaces where honesty and respect were the foundation. This new equilibrium wasn't a return to the past, it was a forward-looking reconstruction, one grounded in lessons learned and reinforced by the certainty that truth, once embraced and acted upon, has the power to create lasting change. By the time the dust settled, the sense of justice and vindication was profound. Mark was no longer the untouchable figure in my life, and the damage caused by his deception was mitigated by the power of exposure, accountability, and unwavering courage. I had faced fear, navigated relentless pressure, and endured the emotional fallout, yet emerged with a strengthened sense of self and a renewed vision for the future. This was not the end of challenges, but it was a pivotal chapter where truth prevailed, where courage was validated, and where equilibrium, hard-won and hard-earned, was finally restored. The aftermath of the confrontation and the legal proceedings left me in a space I had long dreamed of but never believed I could reach. A life reclaimed, a sense of self restored, and a newfound clarity about what it meant to live authentically. The storm of deception, intimidation, and social backlash had passed, leaving a quiet, almost surreal calm in its wake. I spent mornings savoring simple freedoms I had previously taken for granted. The ability to make decisions without fear of manipulation, the comfort of knowing my voice would be heard and respected, and the certainty that the truth I had fought so hard to reveal was now acknowledged and validated. The binder that had once represented months of fear and confrontation now stood on a shelf in my study, no longer a tool for defense, but a symbol of transformation, a reminder of the journey from uncertainty to empowerment. My mother became a central figure in this new chapter, her own transformation mirroring mine in many ways. After years of silent protection and cautious avoidance, she embraced her role as an ally and guide, using her experience to support others who might face similar challenges. We began volunteering together, helping women in difficult marriages navigate the legal and emotional complexities of leaving toxic relationships. Her pride in my resilience and the lessons we had learned together became a driving force not only in my life, but in the lives of others seeking guidance. Our bond, tested and strengthened through shared adversity, evolved into a partnership grounded in mutual respect, empowerment, and unwavering support. The sense of purpose, I found, extended beyond family and personal connections. Friends who had initially hesitated to take sides now became part of a network committed to advocacy, education, and the promotion of transparency in relationships. I gave talks, shared my story at workshops, and collaborated with organizations focused on helping individuals recognize manipulation and reclaim agency. Each engagement, each conversation, each small act of mentorship reminded me that the struggle I had endured was not only personal, but profoundly universal. The challenges I had faced, the courage I had summoned, and the resilience I had cultivated could serve as a roadmap for others, a testament to the power of speaking truth even when it feels impossible. Emotionally, I felt a sense of liberation that was both invigorating and humbling. No longer haunted by fear, self-doubt, or the lingering presence of Mark's manipulations, I began to explore personal growth in ways I had long neglected. I returned to hobbies and passions that had been sidelined for years, finding joy in creative expression, physical wellness, and meaningful connections.
Therapy continued, not out of necessity, but out of a desire to deepen my understanding of myself, to ensure that the lessons learned from confrontation and exposure were fully integrated into my emotional framework. I discovered a resilience I had underestimated and a strength I had never fully recognized, a combination that gave me the confidence to pursue life on my own terms. Even in daily routines, the transformation was evident. Simple decisions that had once been fraught with anxiety were now approached with clarity and certainty. Interactions with former colleagues and friends were no longer filtered through the lens of fear or doubt, but through trust, authenticity, and self-assurance. The lingering shadow of deception had been replaced with light, an inner illumination that allowed me to navigate life without hesitation or second-guessing. I noticed with quiet satisfaction that my energy was no longer consumed by worry or self-protection, but directed toward growth, creativity, and meaningful engagement with the world around me. Perhaps the most profound change came in my relationships with others, particularly those who had been affected by Mark's deception indirectly. I witnessed firsthand the impact of honesty and accountability, the way a single act of courage can reverberate through multiple lives, transforming not just one person, but an entire network of relationships. I became a confidant, an advisor, and a source of strength for friends and family facing their own challenges. The empathy and insight I had gained through my struggles allowed me to offer guidance grounded in both experience and evidence, bridging the gap between theory and lived reality.
The final transformation, however, was deeply personal. I had moved from fear to empowerment, from silence to vocal advocacy, from dependence on a fragile system of deception to a grounded confidence in my own judgment and capabilities. The experience had redefined my identity, not as a woman defined by her past or the actions of another, but as someone capable of shaping her own life, setting boundaries, and demanding respect. I recognized that the true victory was not in exposing Mark or securing legal validation, but in reclaiming my autonomy, my voice, and my right to live unencumbered by fear or manipulation. On quiet evenings, I would sit by the window, reflecting on the journey from the day I shared the divorce papers in the group chat to the life I now led. The fear, the confrontation, the legal battles, and the social isolation were no longer defining moments, but foundational experiences that had forged strength, clarity, and purpose. The binder, once a heavy burden, had become a symbol of triumph, a tangible reminder that truth, courage, and persistence have the power to transform even the darkest circumstances. In that stillness, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that I had not only survived, but thrived, and that the lessons I had learned would continue to guide me and others toward a life defined by honesty, empowerment, and hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload